Hello, I'm Paul Coutu. I'm a retired faculty member at Killingley High School, and in my last 20 years there, I taught government and politics to high school students. In my retirement, which started in 2004, I became the radio talk show host about 5 years ago at WINY in Putnam. And as a talk show host, certainly I got a different perspective of politics than I had previously had. I basically was asked to do this today in a very informal way to kind of review, kind of a social studies lesson review, and looking at branches of government and how they affect you. And if you listen to talk radio, if you listen to TV shows that talk to political issues, you'll have a pretty good idea maybe by the time this is over as to what the landscape is. I've been involved in government and politics for most of my life, like I said, the study of. But I don't remember a lot of the things that I had in math, and I don't remember a lot of the things that I had in science, and perhaps that's true of you for government and social studies. I certainly get a lot of callers on my talk show that talk about a wide variety of things. But one of the things that I often see that it kind of tweaks my psyche about what's being said is it doesn't always jibe well with what the realities of government are, how government works, and what the mechanisms are. And I think we'd like to start there, and we'll take it branch by branch of federal government and maybe even a little bit of state and local government, which very closely mirrors that. Now, well, let's start with the lawmakers, and that would be the legislative branch. Now, our federal legislature is broken into two parts. The United States Senate, they have 100 members, 2 per state, and they are elected for 6-year terms. And only 1/3 of the senators are up for election in any given 2-year cycle. So there never can be more than 33, and one time 34 senators that change over. So when people say to me on my talk show, we just got to get rid of all these guys. Well, it's not quite that easy, because you're going to have 66 or 67 senators who are still going to be there until the next election, and then the next election. You're going to have, in the Senate, a very closely knit club who have worked their way up into a very high position. And the senators in the Senate have the right to speak as long as they wish, unless 60 senators tell them they can't. Almost never happens. It's called the filibuster, and it can be used to delay or simply to head off any legislation that the person speaking wants to head off. And there is no rule about what you can say. You can read the Bible, read the newspaper, talk about your grandchildren, makes no difference. The other part of the United States legislature is the House of Representatives. There are 435 of them, and they are elected on a proportional basis based on the number of people that live in each state. And then within each state, the states are broken down into districts, which have to have a relatively similar number per district. Every 10 years, based on the census, they usually do a reapportionment if the number of congressmen change. For instance, in the last census, Connecticut lost a congressman. We used to have 6, now we have 5. Every state gets 2 senators, but congressman depends on population. Rhode Island only has 2 congresspeople. There are some states that only have, like Alaska, that only have 1. So it depends strictly on your population. When they have to reapportion, if you looked at the lines of where they make the districts, they're oftentimes in the favor of the party in power. They eliminate some pockets that would go against them in certain districts and bring in others to help them. And it's called gerrymandering, and it's pretty common. That's why they're not normally shaped. They're shaped in the way that would help politics. Because let's face it, these people are politicians, and we expect politicians to act like politicians, and then they do the political thing. Both parties have done it. It's an old practice, and certainly some states are better at it than others. Now, in order for a bill to pass, it has got to go through both houses of the legislature. But it isn't quite as simple as somebody saying, I have a bill, I want to pass it. The the person, or the congressman, they call them congressmen, U.S. House of Representatives, the congressman who proposes the bill has to get a number on the bill. He has to then go before the Ways and Means Committee and have it prepared so that they can look at it and say, how much is it going to cost and what's the financial number. Then the Speaker of the House, this is an unusual power that a lot of people don't know about. The Speaker of the House can basically say where this bill is going to be going. Is it going to go to a committee? Which committee is it going to go to? And even if it gets through the committees, where it will appear on the docket, you could be the first or the 975th, which means you'll never get to it. So if the Speaker doesn't like you, you're going to get a number way down low, and your district may never get that bill before the Congress. Now, if the bill is accepted, it goes through Ways and Means, it goes to you, it's assigned to a committee. They have, all congressmen are on committees. You can have committee on maritime, you have committee on agriculture, you'll have a committee on Veterans Affairs, on and on and on. There are tons of committees. Most congressmen serve on several committees. Now, the bill will never get to the floor for a vote unless it gets through the committee. The committee chairman in the House of Representatives is always of the majority party. And that person has an immense amount of power as far as whether that bill ever gets out of committee or not. So they have hearings, and people who are for or against the bill go before the committee and tell the committee why they think this bill is worthy or not. If the committee decides after all the hearings that they have that the bill is worthy, it goes before the whole House. If it's given a number, it goes before the whole House if they can get to it before they adjourn, and they adjourn at various times. And they have to go back home at times in order to speak with their constituents. So Congress is not always in session. There are months during holidays and during the summer when they may not be there. They're home talking to the people who put them there. The disadvantage for the House of Representatives as compared to the Senate is that the senators are elected for 6 years and don't have to be quite as close to the voters. Congressmen from the U.S. House of Representatives are only elected for 2-year terms. So they constantly have to be in touch with their constituents, and they're much more liable to be sensitive to the needs and the feelings of their constituents. And that's an important thing to remember. If you want something, you're more liable to get it from your congressman than from your senator. Although certainly the senators try to serve the constituents, but it's not quite as important for them at any given time to do that, where congressmen don't have a lot of time before they're up for election again. And I don't mean to be cynical, but politics is politics. When a bill comes before the House of Representatives, and usually many bills start there because they have one unusual power in the U.S. House of Representatives. All bills that deal with money, that deal with public finance, come out of the House. They are the ones that actually assign, okay, this is how much we're going to spend or not. Senate bills will come out of the Senate and go to the House. But again, if they can't get a figure together, it'll never see the light of day. But if both houses vote for it, it will go to the president for a signature, and we'll talk about his power to do that later. If only one house passes it and the other doesn't, and they still want the bill, they'll have a conference committee comprised of senators and congressmen to work out any differences, and then they'll consider it again. If they cannot get both the House and the Senate to agree on the bill, even after conference committees and all of the wrangling that goes on behind the scenes, and that's really where it happens, the bill will never get to the president for his consideration, and the bill is, for all intents and purposes, dead. It can be brought up at another time. Slight changes can be made. What often happens in a conference committee, if they can't agree, is that they'll make changes and try to compromise. Sometimes you'll see a bill come out of the House and the Senate that deals with the same thing, and usually they're never exactly the same. So then they'll have to get together to bring them together to make them make sense, and so that they can vote on them. the House will vote on the Senate bill, the Senate will vote on the House bill. But if they're the same, they have to do that. So that's why they do it, because you'd never get them to agree otherwise. Because there is always something in there that somebody either in the House or Senate wants and holds important. So the U.S. legislature, the House and the Senate, makes laws. That is their primary job, to make laws. The process, as we have just seen in this country during this the debt crisis, is pretty ugly. To the average person, it's, why does this make any sense to me? This is not the way I run my house. That's not the way I run my business. This is not the way to do business. Everything's behind the scenes. Leadership has a disproportionate amount of power, and they do. Why does this work? Speaker Boehner, who is the Speaker of the House right now, was asked the other night about the process, and he said, well, it isn't pretty, but it works. Now, the question is, who does it work for? Does it work for politics, or does it work for the nation? And certainly Speaker Boehner was trying to work for the nation as he worked through the political end of what he was trying to do. And convincing your own members of your own party to get in line is difficult. Convincing the other party, sometimes impossible, as we're finding out with the latest politics that are going on in Washington. Don't expect when you see how things happen in Washington that it always can be just for the best of purposes and the best of intentions. There are things that political parties demand of the people that we elect. And they're always walking a very tight balance and a tightrope as to what serves their people and what serves the party. And there are times that one doesn't work well with the other. And there are reasons for this that we oftentimes don't know about. Leadership in the Congress is very important because their job is to basically get people in line behind what they want. The Speaker of the House, the Senate Majority Leader, and the Senate Minority Leader and the House Minority Leader, very important people. Nancy Pelosi used to be the Speaker of the House as the leader of the House of Representatives. When the Republicans took the majority in the last election, she became the Minority Leader. So she has worn both hats, and she understands both sides, as does Speaker Boehner. He was the Minority Leader. He is now the Majority Leader, and therefore the Speaker of the House. The way the legislature works essentially is that once they make a law, and once they iron out, they go through all the committees and iron out all of the differences that they might have. And it's considered both from a political end and from a good public policy end. It's voted on, and then goes to the president's desk. And that essentially, the lawmaking capacity and the ability to fund the laws that they have proposed lies with the legislative branch. So that's essentially, they have other things that they do. They oversee. Once they've made a law and it's been passed, they also oversee them to make sure they're being carried out. There is some oversight done by them. Their job is to make sure that public policy works in the public interest. But frankly, their job is also to make sure that public policy works in their political interest. And sometimes that's where you see the loggerheads that we've seen in Washington. Moving on to the executive branch. If a law is passed through both houses of Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate, it goes to the desk of the president. He has a certain amount of time to sign it. Usually his aides and his closest advisors will have been working the Congress to make sure that the things the administration would like are included in the bill. And since the president is the leader of his party, if one or both houses are in his party, he usually gets what he wants. The president right now, President Obama, has the Senate in his party, but the House of Representatives is the Republican Party, the other party. So he gets a lot more cooperation from the Senate than he would from the House. So now he's got to walk a finer line than he did in his first 2 years when he had both houses in his camp. The president has to now consider, when the bill comes to his desk, as the chief executive, he either signs the bill and it becomes law, or he vetoes the bill, which cancels it and sends it, basically that says the bill is dead. Veto kills it. But the Congress can take the same bill up, and if they can, by a 2/3 majority of both houses, of the House and the Senate, they can override the president's veto. This is one of the checks of power. It's a check and balance. The president can veto it, but if 2/3 of the lawmakers feel that it is a worthy bill, they can override the veto. Doesn't happen very often. Almost never happens when the president is of the party of one of the houses of Congress. Again, both houses of Congress have to say, at a 2/3 level, have to say override. Usually it's a very, very important issue when Congress overrides a presidential veto. Now, let's go to the powers of the president and what he's there to do. He is the person, in the most simple definition, who carries out the law. He doesn't make the law. He can make suggestions to the Congress about the law, but he doesn't make them. In final analysis, they write the laws. The president can approve them, but if they're already laws when he takes office, he has to carry them out. Any new laws he can have a part in. Laws that he inherited, he carries out the law. That's it. He swears, he puts his hand up and says, I swear to uphold the laws of the United States and the Constitution. So the president, as the chief executive, carries out the law. He has lots and lots of different agencies to help him carry out the law. He's got the Treasury Department. He's got the State Department, who does foreign affairs. He's got the Agriculture Department, the Education, on and on and on. He's got departments for everything. When you get to be president, you get to name the heads of these departments, and that sends them in a direction that you want them to go in. Where the government goes is how they carry out the law, is oftentimes the job of the president, and who he appoints is going to basically be the flavor of how the law gets carried out. I'll give you an example. The Democrats are usually very big in the workplace on workplace inspection. The Republicans much less so. So if you have a Republican president, he'll carry out the law, but he'll have the person in charge of that department cut the amount of inspectors, so less inspection goes on. A Democrat will usually get more inspectors, so more inspection goes on. So is the law being carried out? Yes. But how well? Now, one that's near and dear to all of our hearts, because we all like to eat, is food inspection. Those parties who are bigger into more food inspection will have more food inspectors. They'll give more money to that department. Those who are a little more in line with the producers of food, less so. Those are examples that would help you to understand that. And I love the one about food. I once in a while have on my program a person from the Food and Drug Administration, and that's always the one I ask them, how many inspectors do you have out there? Because when we all pick up our fork to eat, we like to feel that we're safe. But this involves every aspect of government that you can have. Now, other things that the president does, he is also the chief diplomat for the United States of America. Through his State Department, we have delegations all over the world, embassies, legations, and he basically sets the tone for the State Department for foreign affairs. And as our chief diplomat, he goes and visits foreign countries on goodwill tours, and also if there's a problem, to try to get the leaders of these countries more in line with the thinking of our government. The president is the chief politician in the United States. He is probably, at least at this point in history, and has been for a while, the most powerful politician in the world. And there's a grave responsibility that comes with that. He not only serves the people of the United States and is the focus of world attention, he's also the leader of his own political party. So there's a lot that goes with this. He's expected to entertain foreign dignitaries that comes, including the leaders of countries. He's expected to meet with them privately to develop policy, just as he meets with our own politicians to develop policy. He's got a huge staff that helps him out. The one guy that you've got to get through to see him is the chief of staff. He's like the final filter to get to the president. If the chief of staff doesn't like you, you're never going to get to see the president. It would be very unusual. The chief of staff is the guy that determines how the president's time is used and what he gets to consider. It's not an elected position, it's an appointed position, and usually presidents appoint somebody that they are personally comfortable with, that they know will protect their interest as the president. Now, the laws of the United States are made on a year-to-year basis. They're seldom changed, though. Once they're in, it's very hard to get rid of a law once you've changed it. Once you've passed it. It's very, very difficult because it's been so difficult to make a law with all of the machinations that you have to go through. So with laws that are on the books, some of them don't even make sense anymore. They're the ones that they usually ignore them. The president, though, is sworn to uphold the law, which is where sometimes conflicts come in, and people say you're not upholding the law. But precedent is a lot of things that a law are anachronistic and they're no longer looked at. So nobody usually calls you on it. So the president's an important guy, and the legislative body makes the laws. He carries them out through his departments. The last branch that's important is the judicial branch. Those are the three biggies. The judicial branch of government doesn't make law, and it doesn't carry out law. What it does is evaluates law. They, just like the president and the Congress, members of the federal judiciary swore to uphold the law. Their situation is, does the law that is passed and signed by the president meet the constitutional standard? Is it in violation of the Constitution in any way? The Constitution is the framework of everything that has to be done in government. If something that's done by government is deemed to be unconstitutional, and it happens, it will be thrown out. Now, understand this. We tend to look at the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is certainly paramount. But before you can ever get to the Supreme Court, you have to go through a system of courts. Now, if this is something that starts at a state level, you can actually have to work your way through the entire state court system, then appeal to the federal courts, and it goes through their system. Now, in general, both the state and federal government have three basic levels. You have the regular district court of the federal government. If your case is heard there, it can be appealed if you don't like the decision, you think a mistake was made, or if you think that you took exception to the decision in some way legally. You then have to go to the federal appeals court, and you make your case before them, and you say there was an error made, and this is why. The federal appeals court will then decide whether there was an error made in the trial. If there was an error made, you get a new one. They don't say you get what you want, you get a new trial. If they say there were no errors made, it stops right there. Now, if you're not satisfied with that, you can appeal to the Supreme Court to please hear your case. They can say no. If they feel previous decisions have been made which go against, excuse me, let me start over. If they feel that previous decisions that have been made by Supreme Courts answer the question, they will not hear the case. They have only so much time to hear cases. They have an immense amount of appeals for them to hear cases. They will take the ones that they think are important or that will set a new precedent that have never been taken on before, something they've never considered. Now, as a talk show host, I can tell you that I hear people use the term a lot that as a social studies teacher kind of sets my teeth on edge. People say, they can't do that, it's unconstitutional. Well, folks, the only people that can decide on constitutionality are the courts. And unless you are a federal judge and ultimately a Supreme Court justice, and there are only 9 of those, 8 regular justices and 1 chief justice. Unless, and by the way, those justices on the Supreme Court, they have to be approved by 2/3 of the Senate. The Senate has advised and consent on that. So there is a check on that as well. So as we look at the court system, I'm going to basically go into a couple of cases that will show you how courts' decisions can change with the times. The judicial branch is a very flexible branch of government in that decisions that are made legally can change. They change with the times. When I hear callers say it's unconstitutional, as I said before, I often kind of cringe a little bit. I'll give you 3 examples of how things change with the times. In 1855, don't hold me to the year, I think it was 1855, it was one year, one side or the other. There was something called the Dred Scott decision, when a slave escaped from his master and was brought back, and he from a free state, and he sued. And the court ruled in the Dred Scott decision that Dred Scott could not sue because he was property and not a person. It essentially said he was not a person, not legally a person. They obviously knew he was physically a person. So, but not a person who could sue, not a citizen, not a free citizen. Obviously, by modern standards, not a very enlightened decision. The Civil War was fought within a few years after that decision, and slaves were freed. But they were sort of in a legal limbo in many areas. What became practice in much of the country, especially in the South, was that they had to be given facilities, so they kept them separate. There were facilities for blacks and facilities for whites. Freed slaves, their children, were totally separate from whites. People didn't live together. They didn't go to the same churches together. They were not allowed to eat at restaurants together. If they were allowed in the theater, they only had to sit in the section way in the back, away from whites. It was a totally segregated society. That was challenged in 1896 in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. And in that decision, the Supreme Court ruled that as long as you provided some sort of facilities, you could keep them separate. So separate but equal was sustained constitutionally, and so the South continued with segregation. In 1954, a case was brought before the Supreme Court. It was from Topeka, Kansas, and it was Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education, Brown versus the board. And in that Supreme Court, different justices, times had changed, the old justices were dead and gone. They ruled that separate was not equal. That the very fact of separating people made them not equal. And that led to the integration of the solid South, the segregated South, and not only the South, but any place that had segregation. Later on, when I was growing up, I remember the riots in Boston because they said there was de facto segregation, where whole black neighborhoods went to their neighborhood school, but they were almost all minorities. And the Supreme Court said that our law must be carried out. You must integrate these schools. Therefore, you must bus students, and that caused a furor. And we know that during the times of segregation, the breaking up of segregation was a time of great strife in the South. But it goes to show you how 3 different legal decisions on basically the same issue, the rights of a certain people, changed with the times, and there are others. So what is constitutional? Constitutional is basically whatever the judiciary, ultimately the Supreme Court, decides what is constitutional. I'll give you another example, and if I said all of a sudden that anybody with red hair can't vote, as ludicrous as that is, if that became a law and it was signed by the president, again, ludicrous, we wouldn't do it, but if it happened, that would be a law until somebody challenged it in the courts. And in that case, instantly it would go through the court system because it was so unconstitutional in its basis. The Supreme Court would rule that that was an unconstitutional law and that it was canceled. Now, in the past, a law could be as thick as the Holy Bible. It could have, sort of like our health care bill. If one part of the law was deemed to be unconstitutional, in the past, because they didn't write in clauses to the laws, the whole law was thrown out. One sentence in the law is unconstitutional, it can be thrown completely out. That was the National Recovery Act passed by the Roosevelt administration during the Great Depression in the 1930s. National Recovery Act had one bad part of it. The whole law was thrown out. Now, when they built the National Health Care Bill, if any one part of that bill is thrown out, they wrote the bill in such a way that only that part is thrown out. But they didn't used to do that. So the courts are the final filter for law. They tend to operate not like politicians at all. They're appointed, once you're appointed to the federal bench, you're appointed for life or until you decide to retire. They're taken out of the political arena totally. Who appoints them? The president will nominate, the Congress must approve, the Senate must approve, and if they are approved, they're in for life. Democrats will tend to will put on liberals. Republicans will tend to put on conservatives. The makeup of the court depends on how long they live, how long they stay on the court. Now that we've kind of covered the duties of, in general, and there are certainly lots of, you could spend a year doing this stuff. We've covered the general duties and responsibilities of the various groups. And again, just a minor review. The legislative branch makes the law, the executive branch carries out the law, and the judicial branch evaluates the law as to its constitutionality or not. And the one thing about the Supreme Court, if they say something is unconstitutional, that's it. It is unconstitutional. And it cannot be put back into effect in that way with that court. At another court, at another time in history, perhaps. But right there and then, that law is dead. You want to do something like it, you must take out the unconstitutional parts and go through the whole process all over again. This is where politics comes in. Political parties in the United States, and when we started out with Federalists, and we had Whigs, and we had Democrat Republicans. Now all we have is Democrats on one side and Republicans on the other. At one time, the Democratic Republican Party was the party of Jefferson. Now let me take you way back to how politics really started. John Adams was a Federalist, as was George Washington. They believed in a strong federal government. That's where the word Federalist comes from. That means the central government of the United States should be strong. Now, the other side of that issue was Thomas Jefferson and his followers. Jefferson believed that the states ought to have more rights and that the federal government should be very minimalist. Now, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were at one time close friends, but once we passed the Constitution and became a nation and started to operate, they became political enemies. Remember now, Adams was the second president of the United States. Jefferson was the third president of the United States, and he beat Adams in the election when he took office. I believe it was 1803 he took office. Now, Jeffersonian thinking is that the less central power you have, the closer the power will be to the people. The Federalist position was that the states are so different in what they want and what they need that it is tough to get any agreement or anything going within a country unless there is a strong federal centralized presence. We are still doing this today. Pick your issue. The Civil War, pick sides. Integration of minorities, pick your side. How much power does the state have the power to say no to a federal law? No. The answer is no. The whole idea of federal is Local government makes local laws. State government makes state laws. You cannot make a local law that goes against the state law. You cannot make a state law that goes against the federal law. That is our federal system. Local, state, and federal. Federal is predominant. State trumps local. Local, if it doesn't violate either of the two, you can make your own ordinances any way you want to. As soon as they go into conflict with state or federal, they're canceled. So they're in. Now we have political feelings, opinions. Let's go into a more modern one. Right now, illegal immigration is a key issue that politicians on both sides are very uncomfortable with, because by taking a position, they have a possibility of losing votes. A disproportionate amount of illegals, certainly not all, but a disproportionate amount, come from Spanish-speaking countries, Hispanics. If a politician takes a very strong position about illegal immigration, they have a chance of losing that large Hispanic vote, which is becoming increasingly important in the United States. There are actually more Hispanics voting in this country right now than African Americans. Now, the law says, the Constitution says you're supposed to carry out the law. But again, as I pointed out earlier, how you carry out the law is going to determine how strong the law is being upheld. Illegal immigration is one of those things that they have not been very strong with, no matter who is in power. In 1986, there were many, many, many illegals in this country, and President Reagan threw up his hands and said, I'll give you amnesty. You can stay, but you got to come forward and register. Register, pay taxes, get a social security number, whatever. So they got a green card to stay here. What's happened since, though, is illegal immigration has increased to a number from anywhere from 12 to 20 million people. Some states, especially border states, are very uncomfortable with this. It's causing financial difficulties within their states at a time when finances are important. It's a conservative versus liberal issue as well. The conservative point of view would be uphold the law. The law says we're supposed to keep illegals out, then we should do it. The other position would be these people are escaping horrible times. They're only coming here to leave what they've known because they're desperate, and we are the land of immigrants after all. We should be more generous. It's a conflict between what the law says and how the law is carried out. A conservative would want the law to be carried out the way it says. A liberal would like some latitude based on past practice. Therefore, let's get into now liberal versus strict construction of the law. And certainly the courts mirror this. A liberal constructionist of the law would say, the law suggests that these actions, it suggests in a more modern way what the law was written, the law was written back in the 1700s. And they'd say, well, the law in the Constitution suggests that this should happen. That's a loose constructionist, a liberal constructionist, if you would. A strict constructionist says, the law says this is what you must do. Now, in my radio talk show, I oftentimes get people from the right who call and say, the law says this, the president should be impeached. And I have to laugh when I see that or hear that, because frankly, that we have had many, many cases in the past where the law has been interpreted in a more liberal way. And it certainly doesn't mean that you are it's an impeachable offense. It basically shows a liberal or a conservative bent, depending on your position. Now, conservatives tend to hate the loose construction. The loose constructionists tend to hate that rigid interpretation of what the law says. Their point of view is, the law was written at a time when we did not have much of what we have now. There was no internet. There were no nuclear weapons. There were no missiles. There were none of the modern things that we now enjoy. And we have to expand the law to cover what is now pragmatic. So I guess you could say in some aspects, the loose constructionists are more pragmatic in the way they look at the law. The conservatives are more traditional and more doctrinaire as to how they look at the law. Now, the law affects everybody. When I was teaching, my students often said, I don't like politics. My father says, that doesn't make any difference what we do, because they're going to do it anyway. My comment to them consistently was, everything that affects your life is done through politics. Everything that affects all of our lives is done through politics. Politics is the science of opinion and the ability to exercise the power of opinion to get what you want and to make the laws that you feel are necessary. Politics affects everybody every single day. And if we don't understand that, and if we just turn our back, or I'm really angry with what's going on, I'm not voting anymore, I'm disassociating myself. Politics can be very, very aggravating. Politics can make us passionate. But politics, it will never go away. Not here and not anywhere in the world. Now, some people keep political thought down by simply using dictatorship and squashing people. They'll use the army, as they're doing in Syria right now. They'll use the army, they'll fire on the city to shut people up because we're not interested in your opinion. That, of course, isn't democracy, that's dictatorship. Their politics is one way. It's our way or you're dead, or you're in prison. We believe in democracy, we believe in the majority rules, we believe in free thought. We are not always as sensitive to minority opinion as we need to be. We have situations now where we're only comfortable listening to what we agree with without even understanding sometimes the other side. I hear this all the time as a talk show host. Some of the more popular and national talk show hosts make a lot of money by only taking one side. And they become as much an entertainer as they are a commentator, because they're giving one point of view and basically destroying the opposition opinion. You're an idiot. You're wrong. How could you think that way? You must be a liberal, or you must be a conservative. Think about the word liberal. In one way, right now, it's become almost a dirty word in certain areas. If you're on a conservative talk show host and you say you're a liberal, you won't even get the second sentence out. How can you be a liberal? Why do you think that way? And then the subject will come up, and then you'll get about two sentences out, and they'll tell you how wrong you are. And of course, everybody that listens that agrees says, "Yeah, give it to them. Yeah, that's the way it goes." That is entertainment, with using current events as an entertainment medium. The ones that work best for us, just like politics, if you hear both sides, and nobody tells you what's right or wrong, they engender a conversation. And then they allow you to make your own decisions. And there are many more like that, but they just don't get the national attention. The ones that get attention are the ones that basically sell soap. And if you're a conservative and you like listening to conservatives, that's gonna sell soap to that group. If you're a liberal and that's all you want to hear, they're gonna sell soap there. Because remember this, all media is commercial. And they need to sell commercial time. And people need to buy that time, and they'll buy it and put it on their air if they can sell it. Considering American politics, it's important to understand the history of the parties and how they operate, and why they take the positions they take. What they call themselves isn't particularly important. Nowadays, we have Democrats and Republicans. There was a time when other terms were used earlier in history, but that's unimportant for today. Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, as they like to say, because he was the first president elected in that party, was, in its essence, a more, and has evolved into a more conservative group. They believe in more Jeffersonian thought. They believe in less federal government, fewer laws, and less spending by the central government. They believe in business. They tend to support business interest, sometimes over social interest, feeling that what's good for business is good for the USA. Republicans are more fiscally conservative in general than Democrats. Republicans feel that the way that government is structured should represent more local thinking and less central thinking. Democrats tend to be more liberal or progressive, and those are interchangeable words, in their thinking. They believe that government should be used more to make people's lives better, that you can have a lot of different government programs to help people, that more tax money should be raised for those programs, and government should have a greater part in your life. Now, understand this, as time has gone along in my lifetime, what used to be very, very conservative is now accepted. A conservative back in 1900 would never have accepted the idea of Social Security or Medicare. It would have been the last thing they would have ever thought about, because they felt that you needed to stand on your own 2 feet, and if you couldn't help yourself, that was too bad. And if there was no church or charity group to help you, then that's the way it goes. Progressive thinking actually started, interestingly enough, with the Republican Party as a reform movement in the Republican Party, and their first leader that was progressive was Theodore Roosevelt, who was a Republican, but he was also a progressive. And actually, around 1912, the Republican Party split into two parts, the progressive wing and the conservative wing, and they split so badly that allowed Woodrow Wilson to win the presidency, who was a Democrat, and the Democrats were really kind of flat on their backs after the Civil War. So that was a big thing. Republicans, over a period of time, have evolved into the very conservative group, though. Now, within a Republican Party, there are very conservative people in their way of thinking. There are others who are very progressive compared to the conservatives in their party, and there are moderates. And the same is true in the Democratic Party. Some Democrats are more moderate than others. Some are downright conservative. But they tend to be, in the Republican Party, less socially conscious. The Democrats tend to look at social programs with more generosity, I guess. So if you wanted to make it, and this is a gross simplification, the Republicans tend to favor businesses helping people. If business is healthy, the country will be healthy. Liberals in the Democratic Party tend to think that the government, if it has enough programs, can help a wider range of people. They're both there to help, and they both mean well. It's just a difference in thinking. As a talk show host, I hear both. As a matter of fact, I have to chuckle because on certain issues, I'll get calls from a conservative who'll say you're a liberal, and on the same issue, I'll get a call from a liberal to say you're a conservative, which basically puts me in the moderate faction, which is where I am. I tend to be more pragmatic, less doctrinaire. Now, I was asked to kind of explain this. People who are very, very close to the thinking of their parties tend to be zealots, and what's good for the party is good for the U.S., and that's unshakable, and it has to be done. And that's true on the left as well as the right. Whatever whatever the party believes, that's good for the nation, and I've got to be a good, loyal Democrat or Republican. So if that's your feeling, you usually sign up for one party or the other. But there's this great gray void in this country called independents. They're members of neither party. And there are more of them than there are Democrats or Republicans. There are more independents than there are Democrats. There are more independents than there are Republicans. And there are more Democrats registered as Democrats than there are Republicans. So during an election, you really have to win the independent vote. And you also try to get what's called a crossover vote. You try to get the moderates of one party or the other to like you for that election, for that one time, and cross over to vote for you. So it's not simple. Right now within the Republican Party, there is sort of a revolution going on that the conservatives, the very conservatives, are starting to get more power in the party than the moderates. They come up with terms like you're a rhino, a Republican in name only, which means that you're not Republican enough. And that tends to change with time, by the way. Right now, if you went to the extreme right of the Republican Party, Ronald Reagan would not fit the mold. He would be too liberal. I mean, after all, he allowed amnesty for illegal immigration. He did other things. He tripled the national debt while he was in office. Very un-Republican. And yet they still hold him up as a model of how to act. But there's always a fight. When the moderates in a party are marginalized, they sometimes will go to the other party in a certain election or on certain issues. And that happens as well. So American politics can be very confusing. But not as confusing as some of the countries who have multiple parties. Because then sometimes in order to get a majority, you have to have party coalitions, which can easily break apart. So our system works pretty well. It's got flaws. When Speaker Boehner says, well, it's not pretty, it's like making sausage. It's not, you don't really want to watch sausage be made, but it tastes good. That's what he's trying to say. It's not pretty when you see how politics operates, but it works. Well, it has worked in most ways. Bernie Sanders is a Republican independent, Republican. He is from Vermont. He is an independent. He's actually more liberal than most of the Democrats. And he's pretty near to be a socialist. And he, because he doesn't hold allegiance to either party, is able to kind of speak freely. During the national health care debate, he looked at a camera during a news conference and said, you people are paying attention to this. You're paying attention to the process and you don't like it. He said, this is day to day. There's nothing any different about this from any other major law that goes through. It's all the arm twisting. It's all the compromises. It's all the deals that are being made. What do I got to give you to get to vote for this? This has been going on forever. We just didn't pay attention. And if you think about where we are right now, look in the mirror tomorrow morning when you're brushing your teeth and ask yourself a question, because I had to ask myself this question. Did we really pay attention? Or did we just elect them and trust them to do what they thought was right? And then when it came out the way we didn't like it, we blamed them. But in a way, doesn't the blame lie with us, who are supposed to pay attention to politics? Who are supposed to say, hey, we elected you, we're going to watch you. But we don't watch them. And then it doesn't come out the way we like it, and it's all their fault. Let me give you an example. This always makes me laugh. A politician says, I'm going to raise taxes. The hue and cry, we're not going to vote for you. Another politician says, I'm going to cut programs. You're not sensitive to people. People are going to suffer. You can't cut programs. Well, what's left? Both parties have done it. You borrow. You postpone the inevitable. We're not going to cut programs. We're not going to raise taxes. We're going to give you everything you want. And we're going to borrow money. And it wasn't a secret. We knew the money was being borrowed. National debt is whatever it is. We did the same thing at the state level, by the way. Don't cut them and don't tax them. We put these people in a corner. Where do you go? All right, we have to borrow the money. That's what they want. That's what we're going to give them. They shouldn't have done it. And you're right. We should have watched them and told them you shouldn't do it. But we weren't going to do that because it was good. It was like a party that we didn't think we were going to have to pay for. And now, in this era that we're in, it's time to pay the bills. And it's important for us, all of us, to understand the process. It's important for us to know why things happen. It's important for us to not just vilify our politicians, but to understand where they're coming from and what pressures are on them. They have the pressure of the voter. They also have the pressure of their party. And they also have the law, to uphold the law, and to do what's best in a pragmatic world. All I can say to anybody in office today, good luck. Thank you for your time. Thank you for listening. All I can say is pay attention, and God bless America.